Every summer, everyone has their preseason predictions. They put out their power rankings. They go, this person's going to be the MVP, and this person's going to suck, and this team's going to be great, and this team's going to suck, and this team's going to be mid, and this player's going to get traded, and this player's going to have a breakout year. And almost all the time, so many of them are right, and so many of them are wrong. For me, I put out a whole deep dive series, all 32 teams. 32 freaking hours or more of content for you guys breaking stuff down, all my predictions. And now what I'm going to do is hold myself accountable. Because it's time to go back. It's time to go back in the Wayback Machine. And by the Wayback Machine, I mean a couple months. To my original predictions that I released over the summer for my 2025 Deep Dive series. And all the things I got right and all the things I got wrong with a couple of caveats. Let's get to it. We're starting with how I'm going to put myself over here, and that's the teams that I feel like I got right, at least for the most part. The Tennessee Titans, I had them as my worst team in the league, and I don't necessarily believe that I was incorrect in that. I know that they had the fourth worst record in the league, but from a talent roster perspective, from a coaching staff perspective, they were, I think, as bad as the Raiders. Who we'll get to later. Now, I like what the Titans have done so far in the offseason, getting Brian Daboll as their offensive coordinator to work with Cam Ward. It's going to open up opportunities for them, I think, in the free agency market with guys like Wan'Dale Robinson, who I think with Cam Ward would work really well together. And I think Brian Daboll is going to be very enthusiastic about working with Cam Ward as somebody that he wanted for the Giants last season in the draft. Couldn't convince the Titans to move up. I like Robert Saleh coming in and being the head coach, getting a second opportunity. Try to create a different culture, a culture of toughness, because outside of that last season with the Jets that he had, those defenses were really good. And he went out and he got Jermaine Johnson, who he loves to be an edge rusher, a team that was very weak off the edge throughout most of the season. Arden Key is likely gone. They're going to rebuild that defense. They trade away T'Vondre Sweat, which was kind of expected. But I like the moves that they made to improve. Now, subsequently, we move on to the Cleveland Browns, who I can't stand what they've done in this offseason so far. They were a team that when I predicted it, I talked about eventually by the end of the year, Shedeur is going to be the starter. It's pretty obvious that was going to be the direction they were going to go with that quarterback room. It was going to be just throwing all these quarterbacks out there, and whichever one succeeded was going to be the guy by the end of the season. Shedeur was the last guy be under center, so naturally he was the last guy to finish it. Carried by the defense through most of the year with Myles Garrett, who had an all-time season. And still not good enough to get this team, anywhere close to sniffing success. So then they fire Kevin Stefanski, and they lose Jim Schwartz because they didn't give Jim Schwartz the head coaching job. In any other scenario, I would have been kind of down on the team giving Jim Schwartz a head coaching position. But this was the only scenario where I felt like that was the right move, especially because when you hire Todd Monken, you've kind of made now a lateral move in terms of, the way that you're improving the staff. So I don't see the Browns really improving on this 29th ranking this season all that much. I think they may be at risk of actually dropping depending on how this offseason goes. But, between the Titans and the Browns, they were two of the bottom four teams that I had going into the season. And, fourth overall pick, sixth overall pick, it's pretty accurate. The Saints there, I thought the Saints were going to be a scrappy team. I brought that up. I'm like, their roster for the first half of the season is actually not as bad as people think. The issue is how much of an impact some of these veteran players are going to have, injuries and trades and all that. I was expecting a lot more movement from the roster than what they did. So they ended up being exactly what I said. A very scrappy team. When Tyler Shough took over, it took him, it gave him a little bit of a boost. I think Kellen Moore proved a lot about his ability as a head coach. And they finished, I had them as the fifth worst team in the league. A lot of people had them as the worst. And they were picking what, 8th in the draft. So again, relatively accurate pick. The New York Jets, same sort of thing. I had them as the 27th ranked team, 6th worst team in the league. They probably were a little bit worse than that, but I think well within the range of what I was expecting. Very low on Justin Fields. I thought that the passing game was going to be brutal. It was. I thought that the ability to run the ball was actually going to be pretty good because of that. I thought the Jets were at least able to put together that at some points on the offense. The defense was so incredibly undercoached, though, that they lose Quinnen Williams midway through the season. They just got T'Vondre Sweat in the Jermaine Johnson trade that we talked about earlier. I really like that move for them because he is very much a 3-down nose tackle, and you just need something on this up the middle here for this defense, to combine with the other guys that you got on the interior defensive line, and now build that edge room the way that you like it if you're Aaron Glenn. So that was, again, I think a relatively accurate prediction for what the Jets were. And then I'll credit myself for the Dolphins, who I had as my number 20 team. And that's pretty much, I think, where they finished in the league, ranking-wise, roster-wise, record-wise. Pretty much everything that I predicted was going to happen was going to happen. You had an offense that was probably going to be under-inspiring. Coach on the hot seat got fired. Wide receiver room that was, flirting with being completely overrated. I said, I'm like, if Tyreek Hill plays like he did the year before or worse, then this easily becomes one of the worst wide receiver rooms in the league. If he plays fantastic, if he gets back, it's one of the best. And of course, we know absolutely destroyed his knee and didn't really play all that much that season. And when he was playing, it wasn't really that great anyway. And it turned out to be one of the worst weaponry rooms in the entire league. The defense, the secondary looked uninspired, couldn't really cover anybody, couldn't get really a pass rush going, anything like that. So it was just, they were a team that was, that sort of benefited from a schedule to a degree and, getting to play the Jets, getting to play some of these crappier teams and, catching teams, I think, early in the season and, just, it wasn't so much of a separation in terms of their talent. But, Devon Achane, I think, did a lot of the heavy lifting for this team. Some of the ones I got wrong, and boy, are some of these incredibly glaring. Oh my God. So, the Ravens were my number 1 team. They didn't even make the playoffs. Now, Lamar was injured. Lamar was injured throughout most of the season, so I will say that injury and them not being able to get a rhythm going was a huge contributing factor in them not making the playoffs even at all, let alone being the number 1 team in the league. I think they took a bit of a step back in coaching by firing John Harbaugh, losing Todd Monken, rebuilding that whole coaching staff. They did take a step back. It'll be interesting to see how that staff and this roster come together in the upcoming season. But I think it's a bit of almost a little unfair to completely say that I was wrong because, obviously the caveat would have been if Lamar gets hurt, this team could all completely fall apart, which is what happened. I think the same can be said for Washington. Jane Daniels just couldn't stay healthy, couldn't find a rhythm on offense. They were my number 7 team coming in, and I think finished as the 7th worst team in the league. So, I mean, I think I was close-ish. We'll say I was close. In that sense. But yeah, that was again just couldn't get anything going on offense because you got that not having the right quarterback in there. There was some clear infighting, it seemed, between Dan Quinn, the head coach, and Cliff Kingsbury, the offensive coordinator. So they sort of threw that all out. I don't particularly love that they got rid of Kingsbury, but clearly there were some internal issues there. The Chicago Bears, I had them as a bottom 10 team in the league. And they completely outperformed. All credit to them. Their wide receiver room played a lot better. Their offensive line played really well. Caleb Williams played really well throughout most of the season. And Ben Johnson coached his butt off for this group. The defense played better than I expected as well. They had a much better all-around team performances, and Ben Johnson brought that team together much faster than even I thought they would, even though I ranked Ben Johnson pretty high in his rookie season as the head coach going in. He outperformed that, just spectacularly. I would say the same thing, absolutely true for the Jacksonville Jaguars, who were my second worst team in the league coming in. They were my number 31 team coming in. I had no faith in Liam Cohen. I had no faith in the offensive line. I had no faith in the defense. I had minimal faith in Trevor Lawrence and the running game and the running back room. And all that turned out to be not true. Liam Cohen, again, like Ben Johnson, coached a hell of a season, got this team on the right track, and it looks like Jacksonville is actually a team that's going to be a threat and something to be reckoned with throughout most of the upcoming seasons. The Raiders, I was way too high on. They were my number 15 team in the deep dive series, and boy, could I have not been more wrong. They were very much like what we saw with the Cleveland Browns, in the sense that the offense was just incapable of doing anything, no matter who was behind center, no matter what they tried to do. And, outside of one really good defensive player, they didn't have a whole lot going on. Their defense was way worse than what the Browns were. I'm maybe giving them a little too much credit here. But, now they have a completely new staff coming in after a one-and-done year with the Pete Carroll experiment that I thought was going to go much better than what it did. I thought Pete Carroll at least raised their floor significantly. I didn't think necessarily he raised their ceiling all that much. But, boy, were they bad. Geno Smith went right back to being New York Jets Geno Smith that we all remembered and that we all thought was going to happen in Seattle and never turned out that way. It was just bad. I know Brock Bowers got hurt. Crosby wasn't, But even if we got the best of both of those guys, Geno Smith was just so bad. Chip Kelly was such a bad play caller. Pete Carroll, his raw stuff just didn't hit the way that people were expecting. He made Patrick Graham look like one of the worst defensive coaches in the history of the league. And I think it really set back this organization significantly. Now they're in a position where they're going to take Fernando Mendoza, number 1 in the draft, who I don't know that Mendoza's ceiling is all that high, but I think you're looking at, you basically now are going to have Jared Goff as your quarterback, which we can argue back and forth about whether or not that makes you a Super Bowl winning team or not. I think that's up in the air, but I think Mendoza as being the next Jared Goff coming into the league is as accurate of a player comparison as I can create. To my credit, I'm going to pat myself on the back. I nailed a lot of predictions here. The Chargers has my number 10 team. I think they finished just about around that ranking. I think that was a fair ranking for them. I thought Herbert played well. They were coached really well. The defense performed. And despite the injuries to Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt, and I thought that they were able to maintain. Omarion Hampton was hurt at one point. I thought they were able to maintain a pretty good level of performances on the offensive side of the ball. Jim Harbaugh did a great job. Minnesota, I had them as my number 16 team. I think that's just about where they finished record-wise in the league. Missed the playoffs. J.J. McCarthy did not play great. I was maybe too high on McCarthy, but I thought that the defense and the rest of the roster really did their part. I thought Kevin O'Connell did a pretty good job as well. The Atlanta Falcons, they were my number 25 team. I think they were that for a majority of the season, right up until the end when they had a little bit of a winning pop there towards the end, sort of playing spoiler to a lot of teams, including the Tampa Bay Bucks. But I think that they were a bottom 7, bottom 8 team for most of the year. Michael Penix was terrible. Raheem Morris was a bad coach, bad head coach. What he'll do as a defensive coordinator in San Francisco, I think, is a lot different. I think there is a huge difference between coordinator and head coach. So I think it's a win for San Francisco, and I think it's a win for Atlanta to not have him. I don't know that bringing in Kevin Stefanski is going to make all that much of a difference. You don't have a first-round pick, and the guy that you traded that first-round pick for is probably never going to play in the league again. So it's just that's a bit of a disaster, and I wonder how much rope they're going to give Stefanski. The Cincinnati Bengals, they were my number 24 team. That's pretty much what they were all year. They're a terribly coached football team on both sides of the ball. And outside of Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, throw T. Higgins in there to a degree, throw a little sprinkle of Chase Brown, but other than that, they got nothing. They got absolutely nothing. Their offensive line is terrible. It's getting their quarterback killed. Then there's only so much that you can do when your defense can't make a stop and you're constantly playing from behind. Constantly. Like, the fact that they were even in some of those games is a testament to how elite Burrow and Chase are. I know you don't give out MVPs to teams that don't make the playoffs, but if there was ever an excuse the last couple of seasons to give it to teams that just couldn't get in the playoffs and couldn't make a dent, Burrow, Jamar Chase, absolutely. Oh, they overcome. If they get a good head coach, I can't believe they didn't fire Zach Taylor. I would have loved to, honestly, I would have loved to have seen them fire Zach Taylor and then thrown the absolute, just thrown a blank check at John Harbaugh. And I think that would have made a world of a difference for what this team's trajectory was. But I think they're looking at another season like the one they just had the last couple of seasons, pretty much ever since they went to the Super Bowl. And they're going to fire Zach Taylor and hope they can land a huge offensive mind in the next cycle. Houston, I had as my number 13 team. I thought that was pretty much what they were. They stunk early in the year. They really picked it up late towards the season. I think that honestly, between the play of CJ Stroud and everything, they sort of found, I think it's fair to say that they were about that ranking, somewhere from the 10th best team to the 13th, 14th best team in the league. Once you put everything together, elite level defense, DeMeco Ryans coaching the defense the way that he did, I think it was fantastic. It was a great job. It really carried the team. Finding an offensive coach, an offensive coordinator to get CJ Stroud back on track the way he was in his rookie season is a huge component to their success in the upcoming season. And the Denver Broncos, they were my number 3 team, and I stand by it. I nailed that. And they were perhaps a Bo Nix injury away from being in the Super Bowl, which is another thing that I said was a real possibility for them. To me, it was my best prediction of the entire deep dive series, was being this high on Denver. Thought their defense was going to be pretty good. I thought Bo Nix had potential to have a great season. I had the wide receiver room really balanced and everything, and I knew that Sean Payton and Vance Joseph together were going to coach up a hell of an offense and defensive side of the ball, and that's exactly what Denver was throughout most of the year. A very well-coached team, very efficient, and I nailed it. I nailed it. Now you look at the Detroit Lions there in the middle with the green outline and the red glow, because I didn't quite know if I should say that I got it right or got it wrong with them, because here's my thoughts on the Browns. You can go back and watch the video and go into the coaching section, which is the first section that I do on these videos. And I spoke very candidly about the Detroit Lions had the potential this year to be what Philadelphia was the season that they were coming off when they lost Steichen and Jonathan Gannon in the same cycle. They lost their offensive coordinator, they lost their defensive coordinator, and they ran it back with 2 inexperienced guys that didn't really have a lot of hype behind them, weren't these great minds on either side of the ball. And it was a disaster for them, especially late in the season where they started pretty good and then they just kind of fell off a cliff because they couldn't get out of their own way, and Nick Sirianni couldn't really carry the load. Same thing happened here with Dan Campbell and the Lions. I still thought they were going to be better than what they were. I just thought that they were going to be one of those teams that was going to sneak into the playoffs potentially and then potentially be one and done if these coordinators didn't work out. Turns out the coordinators didn't work out the way that they were hoping, the way that I kind of saw coming. And it's really tough being these top teams when you have two really good coordinators and you lose them both in the same offseason. That's a lot of turnover in philosophy. That's a lot of learning on the job that you're expecting from two very important parts of your coaching staff. And I think it put Dan Campbell in the same scenario it put Nick Sirianni, which is a bad situation. So that's why I kind of give myself the credit for calling that was a real possibility. But I still have to say that I probably still got it wrong because they were still my number 8 team, and I still kind of thought they were at least going to make the playoffs as a wild card team and then potentially just get dumped out early on. So it's a 50-50 for me on that one because I did specify the coaching thing. And yes, now the two most glaring things that I got wrong were the 2 Super Bowl teams. And not only that, but I had the team that won the Super Bowl ranked lower than the team that lost the Super Bowl. Now, I was way higher on the Patriots than most people were. So maybe to a degree, I should be giving myself some credit for getting it right with them. I thought that, I had them as my number 17 team, and I don't know that anyone had them as a top 25 team coming into this season. I thought that with McDaniels and Vrabel, the coaching was going to be elite and that it was going to raise the floor significantly for them. Now, I didn't think they were going to be, like a top 2 team in the AFC. I didn't think that they were going to be dominating teams in wins, having dominant defensive performances, and getting to the Super Bowl at all. I did not see that coming, obviously. So they were still bottom half of the league of the league team for me. But they definitely performed really well. Better than most people expected. I was probably the highest on them of anybody that did this stuff. But the Seahawks, man, I just got it wrong. This is as wrong as you can get something. This is as wrong. I had the Raiders ranked higher than them. I had the Raiders as my 15th team. Oh, God. 18th team. I didn't believe in the wide receiver room. The JSN Cooper Kupp thing, I was like, it's too redundant. Which maybe to a degree it still is, but JSN, what a season for him. The offensive line performed way better. The offense in general performed great under Clint Kubiak, got him his head coaching job. And Mike Macdonald coached as well as anybody. Him and Vrabel and Sean Payton were probably the 3 best coaches in the league last year. Just amazing performances, and that defense, man, that defense was scary good. And it was really done with the coaching aspect of it, the scheme of it, because you look at the players, the individual players on that defense, and there isn't really anyone on that defense where you go like, this guy's truly elite at his position. Leonard Williams is a really, really good interior defensive lineman. But, they don't really have an edge guy that you go, this is an elite edge guy. They don't really have a linebacker where you go, that's an elite linebacker. Devon Witherspoon is very good. Nick Emanwari had a really great season. Julian Love had a really great season. But, it's not... You're not talking about, Patrick Surtain. You're not talking about, Fred Warner. You're not talking about, TJ Watt or Myles Garrett here. You're talking about Boya Mafe and Byron Murphy, still first round pick, but whatever. It just speaks to how great of a coach Mike Macdonald was and how me not giving him, high enough praise, I guess, in the process really affected the ranking and made me look a little silly here. So, I wish I could say that I was the only person that didn't properly predict the Super Bowl, but I have to say that I think all of us didn't see this Super Bowl coming. I'll say that. For watching, guys, leave in the comment section below what predictions you guys got right, and which ones you guys got wrong. Accountability is key in football discourse. It really is. Thumbs up the video if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. and I will keep coming back. Content. And I'll see you guys next time.